evening. Welcome to the show. I'm Sharri and here's what's coming up. How the Foreign Minister Penny Wong ignored warnings that she was handing your money to an organisation infiltrated by terrorists. That full story in just a moment. Plus, just how much Australian taxpayer funding has gone to this organisation. It will shock you. Inside the Hamas terror tunnels, the first Australian journalist to venture inside Gaza will join us live. And as Albanese is booed at the tennis, why has he hired a left-wing journalist from The Guardian to salvage his political fortunes? There seems to be no method to his madness.
The Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Anthony Albanese. The Deputy Victorian Premier, the Honourable...
But first tonight, Penny Wong caught out ignoring warnings that money sent to agencies in Gaza would end up in the hands of terrorists. We can reveal that tomorrow on the front page of the Adelaide Advertiser are revelations that Australia has sent a total of $200 million to UNRWA since 2010. $200 million. We're going to bring you that front page report from the Adelaide Advertiser in a moment. From the very night of the terror attacks, when families were still being slaughtered in Israel in cold blood, Penny Wong called for restraint from Israel. Then 1 week later, on October the 14th, she announced $10 million in funding for Gaza. This was inexplicable at the time. The Israeli response had barely begun, the ground offensive in Gaza certainly hadn't started, and here was Australia committing millions to their enemy and nothing for Israel. 12 days later, another $15 million. And that's when we asked Penny Wong if she was concerned that Hamas might exploit the money provided to Gaza for terror. We asked what oversight there was for how this funding would be managed. In response, Penny Wong sent us an answer from DFAT. And they said that our humanitarian agreements with partners have strict counter-terrorism, anti-fraud and anti-corruption requirements, which are closely monitored and applied. This is nonsense. There's no close monitoring of Hamas, which is the governing body in Gaza. If Penny Wong herself believed that response from DFAT, that there was close monitoring of any officials in Gaza, of Hamas for God's sake, then you'd be right to question whether she's naive or foolish. Australia has no presence in Gaza, and there's no guarantee that our taxpayer dollars were being spent as they were meant to help innocent civilians. Evidence has mounted over many years that international aid is exploited to support terrorism, including weapons and the financing of Gaza's network of 500 kilometres of underground tunnels. There's a reason Hamas has had enough fuel to power rockets, but the Gazan hospitals don't have energy to operate medical equipment. There's a reason Hamas leaders are worth $11 billion while Palestinians are impoverished. And there's a reason schools and hospitals are third world, while there's a never-ending supply of weapons to fire against Israel and a sophisticated underground tunnel network. As you know, we've spoken about this topic on this show over and over again, including just last week when we showed many examples of UNRWA employees, including teachers, celebrating the terror attacks on October 7. And yet still, with all of this evidence, Penny Wong wasn't moved and obstinately continued to pour millions of dollars into questionable agencies in Gaza. Now, of course, it's important that food and medical supplies be given to innocent Palestinian citizens. Children and families shouldn't have to suffer because of Hamas's cruelty. But this wasn't aid or food or water. In total, since October 7, this is $46.5 million in total aid to Palestinian territories. Now, it wasn't just us on this show raising the issue publicly. We learned today in the Australian newspaper that Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong ignored warnings on the UN agency's links to Hamas in Gaza from multiple Jewish groups and business leaders. They said that there was mounting evidence that UNRWA had aided Hamas in the massacre of Israelis. In fact, the evidence around UNRWA dates back to 2015, when United Nations Watch reported that UNRWA officials were operating 12 Facebook accounts inciting terrorism. Also that year, UN Watch reported that UNRWA employees were inciting the murder of Jews on social media. Despite those revelations and the follow-up UNRWA promises, teachers again incited violence against, and I quote, Jewish apes and pigs just a few months later. Then in 2017, another report that UNRWA teachers were inciting jihadist terrorism and anti-Semitism. Again in 2019, teachers were once again exposed. In 2021, UN teachers celebrated the deaths of Israelis, and then another report in 2022 and March 2023, and on it goes. So how could all of this have come as a shock to Penny Wong or UNRWA itself? The evidence has been overwhelming. Yet United Nations officials claimed they were horrified to learn of UNRWA staff ties to Hamas terror.
The Secretary-General is horrified by this news and asked Mr. Lazzarini to investigate this matter swiftly and to ensure that any UNRWA employee shown to have participated or abetted in what transpired on October 7th or in any other criminal activity be terminated immediately and referred for potential criminal prosecution.
The UN said that of the 12 UNRWA employees who were believed to have been involved in the October 7 terror attacks, 9 have now been sacked, 1 is dead, and the UN says 2 others are still being identified. But as for Penny Wong, she ignored all evidence that linked UNRWA to terrorism and instead kept increasing the amount of money Australia was handing over. She defended the fact that she was still sending money to UNRWA just a week and a half ago, telling us when we asked that UNRWA is the only organisation that can provide basic services to the Palestinians and that Australia will hold it accountable for its adherence to principles of, and I quote, tolerance, non-discrimination, equality and neutrality. This was a fanciful comment because on October 7, UNRWA employees were celebrating the terror attacks and calling for jihad against Jews. The idea that Australian officials would be holding Hamas to account for adherence to principles of tolerance and non-discrimination is laughable. And Penny Wong also raised this issue with Palestinian authorities during her recent trip to the Middle East.
This is an issue I raised with the Palestinian Authority, expressed my continued expectation about those funds being used appropriately. I expressed to them that it was extremely important, given the focus on this, that any funds Australia provides are used appropriately for the provision of the services that we are seeking to fund. And we wanted to make sure that there was appropriate transparency around that. And work with them to ensure that that is the case.
It was only when on the weekend that the United States and other like-minded countries suspended their funding after Israel uncovered evidence of UNRWA's participation on October 7 that Wong's hand was forced. Perhaps reluctantly, perhaps through gritted teeth, we don't know, she announced that funding would be suspended. The media has reported that this outcome was a shock.
The news has sent shockwaves across the region and through the international aid community, the biggest relief organisation in Gaza, to lose funding for now at least from its biggest donors, Britain included.
And bizarrely, there are many international figures who say that the aid should continue to roll to UNRWA despite the evidence linking the agency and its workers to the terror attacks. The coalition today said money should never have gone to UNRWA.
There are very well-documented concerns about UNRWA and the way in which it controls its spending and the people that it employs, particularly in Gaza. That includes using anti-Semitic material and pro-terrorist content in their school books that are taught in UNRWA schools. That includes allegations that funds from UNRWA have been siphoned and given to Hamas pay for their tunnels and other activities. And it includes allegations that UNRWA employees were directly involved on the 7th of October in the terrorist attacks.
And Shadow Minister for Home Affairs James Paterson also made the point that the Foreign Minister knew enough about the concerns to actually raise it with UNRWA when she went to the Middle East, but yet even then it didn't stop our funding.
And if the Foreign Minister knew enough when she met with the head of UNRWA in the region, when she visited, to have concerns about how Australian government money would be handled, that she needed to raise that with him, well, then the question is, should we be giving money to UNRWA at all? Let's remember that the potential alleged beneficiary of this Australian government funding is Hamas, an organisation which is listed in its entirety as a terrorist organisation.
Donald Trump, as president, by the way, stopped funding for UNRWA, and Scott Morrison redirected Australia's aid to the Pacific rather than to Gaza. But with politicians like Penny Wong in charge, there was little concern, apparently, about sending $46.5 million of your hard-earned money to Gaza, despite the very real risk that some of it would be exploited for terrorism against Jews in Israel. All right, joining me now here on set, Sky News hosts Liz Storer and Joe Hildebrand. Welcome to you both.
Hey. Lovely to be here.
Joe Hildebrand, I mean, this should not have come as a shock to the Australian government.
No, but I think the problem is that the left in Australia and around the world has just this incredible blind spot, this incredible naivety when it comes to Palestine. It doesn't take much imagination, let alone all the reported facts that have come out, yours included, to know that, you know, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and it probably doesn't take too many steps to go from activist to freedom fighter, and then thinking, oh, hang on a minute, what are they doing? Obviously, the signs of celebration after these horrendous attacks of rapes and child murders and all sorts of tortured atrocities should have, you know, immediately set off warning bells. But again, this is it's so strange, and I don't get it, but this is something that the left is just obsessed by, and you don't really seem to see it in relation to anything except Jewish people. Like, there seems to be, you know, they've just seized on as their new Vietnam. They're convinced that Israel is this sort of neo-colonial project. And again, they just, there's this incredible blind spot. If they provided a fraction of the scrutiny to Hamas and Palestine that they applied to the Israeli government, all this stuff would be blindingly obvious.
Well, let's bring up that front page that I mentioned a moment ago from the Adelaide Advertiser. This is tomorrow's front page, $200 million for terrorists. Gemma Jones is the editor of the Advertiser, and her team of journalists have done all the work today, and they've calculated that $200 million of Australian funding. This is everyone's taxpayer dollars. You know, we have among the highest personal income tax rates in the world, and everyone's taxpayer dollars, $200 million have gone to UNRWA since 2010. That copy is going to be up online on the Advertiser website a bit later. Liz, this is extraordinary and so upsetting because even without the reports and the evidence, we can see with our own eyes, Gaza and Palestinians are impoverished. There's a sophisticated tunnel network. The Hamas leaders are billionaires in safe harbours in Qatar and Turkey, while the Gazans suffer. And you have to answer, who's funded that lifestyle?
Well, we know exactly who it is, and I think Joe's being far too gracious there, because what's truly disturbing about today's revelation, which isn't really a revelation because people like yourself and myself have been screaming about it for months already, this is just a day of vindication because now it's in the mainstream media, so, now it's true. The truth of the matter is Penny Wong doubled funding to UNRWA in September 2022. So this is a government who has always believed in the two-state solution, even now, when it should be out of the question. Who in their right mind thinks that Palestine should be recognised as a legitimate state so they can amass a military, elect another leadership like Hamas? This is one of the most radicalised strips of earth in the world.
I think the two-state questions is different. I think that's a different topic.
It is,
I
but
think
right now
would like to see a two-state solution if there is a governing body that isn't a terrorist group.
I just think that sounds like an absolute fairy tale, and expecting Israel to live next door to them after everything that has happened. I think Israel is rightly saying, look, that's out of the question now. But you mentioned the $46.5 million that Wong has given since the massacres. But yeah, she doubled funding to this UNRWA. And in 2021, we know that ALP literally made it their policy platform that there should be a Palestinian state. This has long been going on in the ALP. I'm sorry, I do not think any rational person believes that 6,000 people working at DFAT couldn't do the cursory homework that's required to figure out that UNRWA isn't what it appears to be. Sadly, the Red Cross is no better. Netanyahu has called out both of those organisations for the farce that they are, and asking the open question of, are they doing more harm than good on the ground in Gaza, naively funded by millions and millions of dollars coming from wealthy Western countries.
Yeah, it's outrageous. All right, let's have a look at what New South Wales Premier Chris Minns has said today. He's warning that the neo-Nazis who gathered in Sydney yesterday morning will be named, shamed and exposed as massive racists. Have a look at what he had to say.
And the message I would say really loud and clear is those who are attempting to menace people in an anonymous way. In New South Wales, the police have the ability to unmask you. So in front of your family, your friends, your employers, your co-workers, you'll be exposed as a massive racist.
Joe, I hope the New South Wales government does this, but it seems like the hate preachers, the upper house protesters, there's always this tough talk and then nothing ever happens.
Yeah, no, I love Chris Minns, and I think he's doing everything he can. Obviously, the laws against hate speech were clearly not sufficient to get prosecution, even when there was ample evidence. So he's gone back. He said, right, we're going to change the law. We're going to review that law. So good on him for that. But this one, he said that he'll be naming and shaming white supremacists. Again, I love this because that's what I used to do at the Daily Telegraph, and I've exposed a couple of them myself. One of them worked at Parliament House, believe it or not for long. Amazing. But again, you know, this is what Labor looks like when the right is in charge, when good, solid, sensible mainstream Labor is in charge. There is zero tolerance for anti-Semitism. Minns has been really strong on saying that Jews have to feel absolutely 100% protected here. And on the white supremacists being cowards, I mean, firstly, if they're so passionate about, you know, the purity of their race, the purity of their blood, why are they hiding behind masks? And if they're tough and if they're so strong, why do we always catch them in North Sydney and Artarmon, huh? Why aren't they out there in Blacktown? Go on, fellas, go and have your little march in Liverpool. See how long you last. So be my guest.
Well, exactly. I would like to see this group named, and I hope it's not just a press conference. I hope, I mean, the Premier made the point that the police have the power to do this, to unmask those individuals, but is it going to happen? It just seems like the Premier has the right intentions, and then you get to the Police Minister and she's a bit soft, and then it all falls down.
Literally, until I see some action in this space, some real world action on the ground, is it any look I in part blame Minns for these Nazis surfacing because look how limp-wristed he has been on the hate preachers, on the mob outside the Opera House. Oh, now apparently they weren't even saying gas the Jews.
That's not his fault. That's the likes of Crikey and Antoinette Lattouf.
He didn't send in the riot squad. He has done nothing about the hate preachers. Now there's going to be a review into 93Z, which should have captured these hate preachers. I mean, if saying kill the Jews from pulpits 5 times over in Western Sydney doesn't classify you as triggering 93Z as it stands, then what a joke of a law. This man is all talk. I can't believe him until I see some action, Joe. I'm sorry.
Joe, it's
I know you love him.
Aren't being implemented.
So why wouldn't these Nazis just be like, fine, we'll get in out.
He's doing everything he can, and he's not stopping until he gets the result.
He's saying the right thing, but there has been no action.
That's right. First he said, you don't even have to take it to the DPP. The Director of Public Prosecutions doesn't have to make a decision. Cops can just go and anyone they suspect of hate speech they want. Then when he saw that that wasn't happening enough, then he went back and said, right, we're going to go back and we're going to review the law. I mean, the guy is he's not an operational police commander. He can't go out there in George Street and say, right, I want you over there, officer, and you over there, constable.
He could have passed an amendment.
The police. I mean, we saw governments directing police to be heavy-handed during COVID. We haven't seen that when it comes to the hate preachers.
No, that's a bit. Firstly, what that wasn't Minns. That again, that's a left-wing Labor government in Victoria as opposed to a right-wing Labor government in New South Wales. They're two very different beasts. And again, the government was
doing it in New South Wales as well. I mean, breastfeeding mothers who sat on park benches were being moved.
Yeah, but that wasn't the Labor. That was the Liberal government. Again, this was not. None of this.
No, my point was that governments do have the power to direct police to be tough. That's my point.
That's right, and he is clearly doing everything he can to make sure that has happened. Obviously, the Police Minister, Yasmin Catley, didn't have a very good week when it emerged that the police were making some pretty strange and crazy decisions under her watch. She has clearly been spoken to by the Premier. And again, everything he's doing shows he is absolutely 100% serious about this.
I'll believe it when I see it.
All right, Liz Storer, Joe Hildebrand, thank you both so much.
Thanks,
Liz, we'll see you 10 o'clock tonight on The Late Debate. Now, as the dust settles on Anthony Albanese's broken election promise on the Stage 3 tax cuts, there have been serious doubts now about the PM and his ministers keeping their word. It's opened up the floodgates about what other promises Albanese is potentially willing to break, like any changes to negative gearing or franking credits. The Prime Minister hasn't ruled it out, and the Treasurer today said he's not contemplating any changes.
We're not contemplating or considering resurrecting the policies that we took to the 2019 election.
Are you prepared to break other promises if there are better ways, or is this one and done?
We're not contemplating other areas.
Now, this hasn't been helped along this morning by Labor backbenchers who privately told The Australian that they want to see negative gearing revisited. Let's bring in now Nationals leader David Littleproud. David, welcome to the show. Look, on the Stage 3 tax cuts, the Prime Minister has left the door open to negotiating with the Greens, so the package that we've seen might not even be the final version. But the question is, will he need to do this, or will your coalition support Labor's version of the tax cuts?
Well, in principle, we don't support it. This was a tax cut, a tax break for Stage 3 to be completed, a total tax package that both ourselves and the Labor Party both agreed to before the last election, went to the Australian people and got a mandate on. Before in 1922, the Labor Party did it. The reality is this is a broken promise, and about a week and a half ago, it wasn't even on their radar, but apparently had the modelling done. And what he's done is blown up sensible, much-needed tax reform for short-term political expediency. And it hasn't even gone to address the drivers of inflation, what's keeping inflation higher longer. And instead of having temporary targeted measures, particularly for those that got the first two stages of tax relief, and stick with the Stage 3, he has blown it all up for short-term gain. Now, we'll have a look at what the legislation is, but we've got to be careful with this. Our DNA is that we want to give as much money back to the Australian people as we possibly can. They know how to spend it better than government departments, and so it's important we work methodically through this. We'll look at the legislation and we'll make a decision, but this is about basically pitting one Australian against other, predicated on what your job is, rather than sticking to what was an agreed tax reform, much needed around tax bracket creep, that is the inflation of taxation. And the fact that he walked away from it for political expedience, all thrown away that reform when there could have been targeted temporary measures for those lower middle-income earners that would have alleviated much of the concern, shows that this Prime Minister doesn't have the values nor can be trusted.
Well, part of Labor's strategy here, according to Labor sources, is that this move will now wedge you and Peter Dutton, the coalition, because you'll have to make a decision. If you support the tax cuts, then Labor has a win. But if you don't, then Labor will claim that you're saying vulnerable Australians don't deserve greater tax relief. Do you think this does put you in a difficult political position?
Well, firstly, it's important to remind those lower income earners that we were the ones that gave them tax relief in stage 1 and 2, and that we think there's a better way than rather dividing this country based on what you earn, to give that targeted temporary approach around cost of living pressures for those low and middle income earners to complement the stage 1 and 2 that we've given them. That would have been a sensible approach, a fair approach to making sure that we could support them through this cost of living crisis that Labor's created. And when you look at what the drivers of inflation
are you going to argue
your power
now?
bill and your food bill.
Pardon, are you prepared to argue now, though, that lower income Australians don't deserve the extra $18 a week that the Prime Minister's saying they'll have under his package?
Well, it won't go far enough when the real wages have reduced by about $153, yet this will give them back a little over $15. There has to be something that helps those those low and middle income earners. Now, we'll obviously work through what happens in Parliament. We have to see the legislation, and there's not just the coalition that will work through this. We have to work through this with the entire Parliament, and we'll understand where we get to at that juncture. But if we become inherent with this after this sitting, then obviously going to the next election, we'll continue to try and work through to give more back to the Australian people. But we went to the last election, so did Labor, promising the completion of this tax reform, and we don't believe that it's right to walk away from it when there are other mechanisms, like temporary targeted measures, that could help those small and low income earners.
All right. The Prime Minister isn't getting a good reception to his broken promise. As you now know, he was booed at the Australian Open last night. He's brushed this off. He claims there's a tradition of booing politicians at sporting matches. Have a listen.
The Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Anthony Albanese. The Deputy Victorian Premier, the Honourable...
Did you expect that, Elbow?
Oh, it's a bit of tradition in Australian sport, isn't it?
It is.
Look, I'm going to come back to this in a bit more detail later in the show, but do you think that this is a reflection of his broken promise?
Oh, I think it is, and I think it's the pain that Australians are feeling, and what they want is a Prime Minister that will unite them, not divide them predicated on your job, but look at what's ahead of you and actually go to address the real drivers of what's hurting families out there, their energy bill, their food bill, and their mortgage rates, and they're all intertwined. They're all being hurt by the decisions he's made. And I think that's the real sentiment that you're feeling, not only at the tennis, which is only a small microcosm. I think if you walk the streets of any capital city or regional town, you'll feel that pain. The real decisions that are being made by families at the checkout about whether they get fresh meat or whether they actually have fresh produce, those are the real decisions that are being made because their mortgages are up, their electricity bills are up, their fixed costs are up. They've stopped going with their discretionary spend to spend at Jerry Harvey. They lost that a long time ago, and this Prime Minister's been out of touch. And when he can't be truthful with the Australian people, then that erodes the confidence and faith, not only in the Prime Minister, but the institutions that Australians hold dear. And when the Prime Minister's done that, I think he's going to get a boo in most places he goes to at the moment because, unfortunately, he's not only let us down, he's lied to us.
Yeah, all right. Nationals leader David Littleproud, thank you so much for your time. Now, coming up on the show, the Prime Minister, in trying to rescue his political fortunes, has hired a left-wing journalist from The Guardian, plus the first Australian journalist to venture inside Gaza will join us live. His revelations are incredible. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, later in the show, I'm going to talk about how Anthony Albanese is being urged to start to woo Republicans ahead of the possibility of Donald Trump becoming president once again. But first, my guest now, Yoni Bashan, is joining us live from Israel. He's the first Australian media journalist to venture into Gaza since the Hamas October 7 massacre. He's here to share what he's seen. It's remarkable. Yoni Bashan, thank you so much for your time. Look, you've been doing incredible reporting since the terror attacks unfolded. You flew into a war zone. Now you were brave enough to go into Gaza. I think one of the amazing things from your revelations that I'd love you to talk about is how there are booby traps for Israelis set throughout Gaza. One of the stories you report is about a tape playing of a baby crying, which was designed to lure Israeli soldiers into a building. Can you tell us about this and what else Israel is facing when they go into Gaza?
Well, thank you, Sharri. I think the story of these booby traps is one of the most instructive lessons about the war that's being fought in Gaza. It started in the north. It's obviously into its second phase now. Forces are entering Khan Yunis in the south, and these sorts of booby traps are just everywhere. So it's very common for soldiers to see someone dressed as a civilian, drawing them out into the open, and waiting at an angle will be a sniper in another building. Or in one case that was conveyed to me by a soldier who had been into Gaza, they'd been on the ground for some time, a couple of days, and they saw a man emerge from a house armed with a knife. He had the knife to a woman's throat. The woman was obviously in a state of distress. He dragged the woman inside the house in full view of the officers, and the expectation was that they would then chase this man and the woman into the home. What they did first, though, having learned the lessons of previous deaths in Gaza, was they called in one of the commando units to conduct a security assessment. The assessment returned about 3 hours later. The house was completely rigged with explosives. They fired a grenade in there and the house was blown practically sky high, is what I was told. So it's a very common story in Gaza. It's a combination of tunnel warfare. It looks like Fallujah. It's densely packed, and all the militants look like civilians.
Well, yeah, that's another point you made in your article, that it's very difficult for the IDF to work out who is a terrorist and who is a civilian, because it's not like Hamas wears an armed combat uniform. They dress in T-shirt and sweatpants.
That's correct. It's a T-shirt, it's a hoodie, it's sweatpants, and quite often they'll be seen walking down the streets without actually holding any weapons. So they look perfectly like any other civilian non-combatant. The challenge that the Israelis are facing is that what these people do, and that the military strategy on the ground for Hamas, is to hide RPGs, Kalashnikovs, anti-tank missiles in secreted locations. They'll either be in houses, they'll be around corners, they'll be in gutters, or in any place where the Israelis can't see them. They'll then use the tunnel system underneath the city to navigate to strategic locations where the weapons have been pre-stored. And they'll emerge for a few seconds only, fire a weapon at the Israeli positions, and then disappear into the tunnels again to safety. So the challenge there, as conveyed to me by the troops that I was embedded in, was you basically have a few seconds to identify the source of the fire back at it, apprehend or neutralize the threat as the militants are retreating. But in many cases, that's not possible. You have a few second window. You obviously don't always get to take your shot, and the militants get away. And it's one explanation for why the war is just dragging on at this grinding pace. It's because it's a game of inches between both sides.
And it's obviously very difficult and very dangerous for the young Israeli soldiers. I mean, many people forget that the Israeli soldiers who are going into Gaza, who are having to take on these terrorists in these tunnels, are 18, 19, 20, 21. You know, they're people's sons and brothers. Many of them have family in Australia. It's very risky and dangerous. Yoni, you also covered Penny Wong's trip to the Middle East. In your reporting, you painted her as being two-faced, putting her hand on her heart as she walked through Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, then again doing that same gesture when in the West Bank. What were your impressions of her visit?
Well, I think to some people they might have construed my analysis of her visit as being two-faced. I'm not sure if I quite arrived at the same conclusion. And to be perfectly honest, I've spent a lot of time really trying to think about what the purpose of that trip was. And I don't think I've actually come to an adequate conclusion for it. I know that there was pressure on the Albanese government to send an emissary to Israel in the aftermath of October 7. I think that's part of the reason why Penny Wong came. I think part of the reason may have been to express some solidarity with the Jewish state and with the families of hostages who are being held in Gaza, which is something that she certainly did. But I think she also framed her visit as not a trip to Israel and not a solidarity visit, nor was it a visit to purely check on the status of things in Ramallah, which she also went to visit and met with the Palestinian Prime Minister. She framed this visit very much as a regional tour of the Middle East. So it wasn't specifically a trip to Israel. She was in Jordan for a period of time, meeting with the foreign minister there. I was present at a press conference that she attended with the Jordanian foreign minister, where he made some truly reprehensible remarks about October 7, saying that, repeating the remarks of the UN secretary that were made a few months ago, that the events of October 7 didn't, quite literally, he said that it did not happen in a vacuum, and that there was a context to it. But I think we also have to realize that what diplomats and politicians say in public in this part of the world sometimes doesn't mirror what they say in private. And so I think what Penny Wong was ultimately trying to do by coming to Israel and to the Middle East was to express Australia's positioning on the crisis. I don't think anyone wants to see any more civilians being killed, either on the Israeli side or on the Palestinian side, of course. And I think it was purely a gesture to express that position and try and express some kind of influence in the region, even though in reality, Australia's influence on the Middle East is really quite minimal.
Yeah. And just as well, it is minimal. Now, just before you go, I just wanted to ask you about how the hostages who have managed to get out of Hamas's control are adjusting to life in Israel. Are any of them back at work? How traumatised are they?
Well, sadly, I think we only know a fraction of the actual trauma that these hostages experienced, and indeed what the remaining 136 captives in Gaza are undergoing every single day. The slivers of information we are hearing are harrowing. Of course, for those who've returned, they're not back at work, with the exception of maybe one or two. We know from the people who have got out that their pathway back to normal life is just so unclear because they themselves were in captivity while their family members were being buried in Israel because they'd been killed on October 7, or they might have siblings or parents still being held hostage. There's a tremendous sense of guilt to being let out while there were people that were inside with them remain behind. So how does one get on with normal life knowing that a family member or a friend is still in captivity in Gaza? So it's just layer upon layer of pain and disbelief and numbness, and without any doubt it will be an incredibly long road to recovery for them.
Yeah. All right. Yodi Bashan, we have to say thank you for your incredible reporting in The Australian over the past few months. It must be quite hard for you to be living this day in, day out to bring us the news and the actual news compared to the news that other media outlets report. So thank you so much. Now, still to come, a left-wing Guardian journalist is set to run Albanese's media team. But is this really the Prime Minister's plan to speak to mainstream voters? I'll discuss this with Cameron Milner and Bronwyn Bishop after the break. Well, now to the Prime Minister's broken election promise on tax cuts. What we know is that Labor's retreat from stage 3 tax reform means that the problem of bracket creep is going to worsen for Middle Australia. It also exposes a bigger problem, that our tax system is far too reliant on personal income taxes and needs an overhaul. According to the International Monetary Fund's report on Australia, there's merit in a comprehensive tax reform, and it highlighted that rebalancing the tax system from direct to indirect taxes. Journalist Tom Dusevic also writes in the Australian newspaper how Australia is right at the top of the global ladder in reliance on direct taxes, such as personal income and company tax, which account for more than 60% of revenue. He writes that other advanced economies with a AAA credit rating like South Korea and Canada make do with a 40% share and put greater weight on taxing consumption. Well, to discuss, let's bring in our Political Insiders panel, former Speaker of the House, Bronwyn Bishop, great to see you, and Bill Shorten's former Chief of Staff, Director of GXO Strategies, Cameron Milner in Queensland. Welcome. Cameron, let's start with you. The Prime Minister has clearly taken the biggest political gamble of his prime ministership so far with this broken promise. It's now brought into question other promises, whether he's going to change negative gearing or further changes to franking credits. How badly do you think this broken promise is going to affect him, even if many Australians support his reform?
Well, look, I think we start from the premise that lots of politicians lie. So it might not be any great surprise to viewers that on this particular occasion, the Prime Minister's broken a promise. But I think that the issue here is the Prime Minister made integrity and trustworthiness a central core and pillar of his Prime Ministership, and he's clearly broken that compact with the electorate. But having done so on stage 3, having introduced 37% tax bracket, having reintroduced bracket creep, let's have the conversation about negative gearing, capital gains tax and franking credits. Let's actually have a proper conversation, as the Treasurer of Australia said in the past, about tax and tax reform. Because now all bets are off and the table should be wide open to all those discussions, and Labor should lead that reform and lead that discussion going forward.
Oh, they can't do that though, can they, Bronwyn? I mean, they would just be voted out if every single thing they took to the election, they promised not to touch negative gearing, they promised not to touch franking credits, although they have already broken that promise as well. Surely the Australian public would lose even greater faith because, Albanese said, "My word is my bond."
Yeah, well, Cameron, I disagree with your assessment that all things are on the table and they can discuss anything they want. The fact of the matter is, Sharri, that there is form here. Of course, Paul Keating broke his promise about tax cuts that were promised, and they were in LAW law, then passed a law to rescind that. So, and then lost the election. Now, you're right about this. Integrity became such a buzzword in the lead up for Labor and the Teals. And now I watch the Teals trying to worm their way around the fact that integrity is lost. There isn't any. So when you've got a Prime Minister that says, the world, my word is my bond, you just can never again trust the man. Never. So people are scared. They are starting to think, is he going to go after a capital gains tax on my family home? Is he going to go for death duties? Is he going to do all the things that Bill Shorten wanted to do before?
Well, and Albanese himself had argued the case for death duties some 20 years ago when he was a young politician.
Correct. And then today you had the Treasurer again using weasel words. Oh, we're not considering doing anything. Where is the journalist who is going to say to that Treasurer, are you committing not to change the laws on these questions? Who's going to put that question to him? Because he gets away with saying, we're not thinking about it yet. Well, they weren't thinking about this either, were they? Then suddenly they were.
Look, there's no question that this is a major gamble that the Prime Minister's taken. Cameron, I reported on Thursday evening that this was about, in part, the Dunkley by-election and the Prime Minister's desperate bid to win the Victorian seat. It's got a margin of just 6%. It's a bit of a fulcrum seat, some 16 seats on margins of less than 6%. So, do you think this was, in part, and especially the timing, about Dunkley when the Prime Minister was considering this?
Well, for no other reason, because we knew by the time he broke his promise last week that they'd been planning this since December, and December was regrettably when Peter Murphy passed away. So we knew a by-election was coming in Dunkley. We knew that Dunkley was going to be a highly contestable seat given Albanese's current lack of popularity in the electorate. So it's a huge issue. He panicked, Labor panicked, and brought forward what they're probably always going to do in terms of the May budget, in terms of gutting stage 3 tax cuts, because, as we've spoken before, it was no great secret that they wanted to do that really.
Now, let's move on to another topic. The Guardian newspaper, or the Guardian online site's political editor, Catherine Murphy, has left her job after 28 years in the press gallery to join Anthony Albanese's media team. There's been a bit of a revamp in his office. Twiggy Forrest's former media advisor, Fiona Sugden, she used to work for Labor in around 2007. She also joins the office. Now, for anyone wondering, this is what you have to write about to get a job with Albo. Catherine Murphy writes that Albanese travelled a lot in 2023 for one reason: the relationships he is tending and the coalitions he is building, and they serve Australia's national interest. In another article, she writes that Albanese has decades of experience in prospering through complicated power plays. It shows on the world stage. And meanwhile, while she's been praising Albanese, she's been a fierce critic of Peter Dutton. At separate times, she's called him Australia's figurehead of fear and fake news, a polariser, and a stop-the-boats, hard borders isolationist. As you might have heard by now, Peter Dutton took an epic swipe at her on Twitter, saying, and this is sarcastic, "I'm genuinely shocked to see Murphy take up a spot to now be officially running lines for Labor. The real outrage is that David Crowe missed out. He's a Herald reporter. What more must he do to prove his credentials to formally be employed by the Labor Party? Hashtag give Crowe a go." Now, Bronwyn, someone in the right joked with me today that in the coalition joked with me today that Catherine Murphy would have to move into the centre a little bit because she's so far left at The Guardian. But is this madness? I mean, Albanese needs to speak to mainstream voters, so why is he hiring someone from the left?
Because he needs to rebuild his confidence. I hope she's getting a big pay rise because the jobs he's been given is impossible. She has to now try and spin that the man who's broken a fundamental promise is now a man of integrity. So I just think it's his psyche, I think, is not in a good place. The Voice really did affect him. And that booing at the tennis the other night, and that was like a cacophony of boos. That was not just it's a politician, let's have a go.
Yeah.
This was heartfelt sound that was coming from people who said, we don't approve of you, mate. And he's bringing her, in my opinion, to boost his own morale. So he's got a sounding board of someone who genuinely likes him and says, I'm going up there to help you and protect you.
Well, Cameron Milner, you know more than anyone how hard it is from time to time to give Labor leaders advice. Obviously, you work for Bill Shorten. Do you think this is the type of person, a far-left journalist, who Albanese needs to hire?
Well, I don't think Catherine Murphy's changed her job. She was an apologist for Albanese when she was paid for by The Guardian. She's an apologist now that she's paid for by the taxpayers of Australia. She writes some nauseating, like vomit-inducing material about Albanese, which is actually plainly wrong. She's attacked no voters as racist. She thinks he should travel the world more on Toto 1. Frankly, if that's the advice that he's bought, all that Albo's got is a sycophant and someone who's going to tell him yes when he actually needs to hear some hard evidence that he should go out and meet some voters and actually do something about the cost of living. So Catherine Murphy's not the solution. Regrettably, she's a symptom of the problem in his office.
Yeah, all right. Very strong comments there and insightful too. Cameron Milner, Bronwyn Bishop, thank you both so much. Now, after the break, the pictures that will have Ukraine devastated. Our Taipan choppers are being torn to pieces despite Zelensky asking Australia to donate them to fight Russia. Plus, should the Labor government be starting to woo Republicans? More after the break. Welcome back. Well, let's bring in now senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, great to see you. Look, we've seen these pictures emerge of decommissioned Taipan helicopters being dismantled. This is after they were ruled too dangerous after a fatal crash last year. But Ukraine wanted us to donate these choppers to their war effort. They could have even used some of their parts. Instead, they're being turned into scrap. Why weren't they sent as Zelensky requested? And, do you think this is disappointing?
This is a huge wasted opportunity by the government. These helicopters, if they'd been transferred to the Ukrainians, could have firstly assisted the Ukrainian army with battlefield mobility to get their troops from one location to another quickly to defend against Russian attacks. And secondly, they could have, and more importantly, they could have been used for medevac to save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers that have been wounded. But instead, what we're seeing is these helicopters being ripped apart, destroyed and buried. I mean, it's a huge wasted opportunity by the government.
Yeah, especially when Ukraine has been asking the Australian government for so much assistance in terms of military support, and this was such an easy one to give. Look, Malcolm, I want to ask you about the US election. We're seeing reports in the newspapers that the Prime Minister is being urged now to start developing ties with Republicans, and Kevin Rudd is reportedly starting to forge relationships with the Trump team in anticipation of him getting back in the White House. This didn't happen last time.
No, I think there's a recognition that there's a real chance that Trump certainly will get the nomination and has a real chance of winning the election. And I think the US-Australia alliance is so vital to our security that it's incumbent upon us to actually recognise that we do have to work with the Americans, even if we disagree with the president that's in office at the time on many issues. And so I think it's really important that we work with incoming Republican officials, work with the US Department of Defense and the national security community, and maintain a stable US-Australia strategic alliance. Because if we don't, if we basically essentially walk away from that, then we are far more vulnerable to attack or to coercion from the likes of China. And our only response then would be to dramatically boost defence spending well above what it is now, from 2.0% right now to maybe 5 or 6% in that scenario. So it's in our interest to work with the Trump administration.
Yeah, and already we should be, and we're being urged to increase our defence spending as it is, even with the US support. Malcolm Davis, thank you so much for your time this evening. And thank you all for watching tonight. I'll see you at 8 o'clock tomorrow. And right now, here's the man of the hour, Paul Murray.